Okay, so models number 3 and 4 then. This is an opposing pair of models. So really we want these articulating, so you may need to get your study models, have your registration blocks made, get these articulated, so just on a simple plastic hinge, just so we can see the relationship between the upper and lower models, what ICP contacts we've got, whether we've got space for the component parts of the denture, which teeth need opposing, whether there's space, whether we're going to increase the vertical dimension, whether we're going to go back to centric relation and so on and so forth. So you can see here that we've got bilateral free end saddles at the top, unilateral on the bottom, and we've got this 8 at the back as well, which we may want to oppose with an artificial tooth. So to kick off our design, then we're working through the system of design that we're normally working through here. So we can start off with our saddle areas. Where we've got these free end saddles, we're going to have some mucosa supported, a mucosa supported portion of the denture, aren't we? So this is going to be tooth and mucosa supported. So here we want to try and keep the saddle area as large as possible. So just like a complete denture would be coming all the way back behind the tuberosity. Same on this side of the arch, all the way around like so. And then when we have mucosa supported portions of a denture, we want to limit the occlusal table as much as possible, so we can certainly take off those and probably take off the 7s as well. We may want to incorporate a 7 on this particular design because we've got an opposing tooth down here, but by default we try and get rid of it. Makes life a lot more simple. And then once we've got our saddle area put in, we can go on to support. Well, the support is being provided in this area by the footprint of the denture, which we're making large, and of course will extend into the connector and so on. With regards to support, we want to go apply the rule for free end saddles, so that's go on to the opposite side of the abutment tooth as a minimum. So we can put our occlusal rests on there. And then once we've got our support taken care of, we may come back to support in a minute, by the way, when we're looking at indirect retention and so on, but for the minute that will suffice. Then we go on to retention, and it's at this point you want to be putting the model on the surveyor and looking for undercut distal to the premolars and on the distal to the abutment teeth, in this case the premolars, and on the buccal aspects to see whether we've got undercut that we can engage with our denture to create a path of insertion that's different to the path of displacement, and also on the buccal aspects to see whether there's adequate undercut for clasping. So in this case, with regards to the path of insertion, I would make the path of insertion equal the path of displacement, because there's very little undercut here, so I wouldn't complicate matters. Remember, these are the simple cases where you can engage the undercut because there's nothing restricting the path of insertion, but here we've got very little undercut on the distal aspect. We have got nice undercut on the buccal aspects of the teeth, so we can put some clasps on. On these premolars, I'd be inclined to go for gingival approaching clasps because they're towards the front of the mouth. We can keep the clasp arm nice and long. Remember, these need to be somewhere in the order of 14 millimeters long to remain flexible, so they don't go beyond the elastic limit. And then once we've got our clasps on and we've thought about the path of insertion, that's the retention taken care of, we can think about reciprocation. So everywhere we have a clasp tip, we need to put reciprocation on the opposite side of the tooth, and by default I go for reciprocating plates because they're simple to make functional. You can go for reciprocating arms or the RPI system in this case. For both of those, you'd need to be back on the surveyor looking at this side of the tooth to see whether the reciprocating arm is going to be effective. And if you're doing the RPI system, we're going to need a guide plane on the distal aspect of the tooth and thinking about where the minor connector is going to be opposing the clasp tip. But for now, let's consider putting reciprocating plates on. Nice for the patient's tongue, simple to use. And then once we've got our reciprocation on, we need to think about bracing. So this is this sideways movement of the denture. And I said that typically it looks after itself, particularly when we've got a lot of components on the teeth. So the reciprocating plates, the occlusal rest, the clasp arms provide some reciprocation. Likewise, the palate will, particularly when it's deep like this one, where the palate and the flange of the denture is going to be opposing the side walls of the alveolar. That's going to provide bracing. Where we've got these free and saddle cases, we can think about cross arch bracing. Again, when we apply these simple rules, cross arch bracing looks after itself because we've already incorporated these occlusal rests into the mesial aspects of the abutment teeth, so we're okay there. Then connect everything up. So I'd opt for a full palette like this wherever you've got extensive free and saddles, because this is going to provide additional support and retention for those free and saddles. Quite a large free and saddle this, isn't it? So we want to try and get as much retention as we can. Remember, we can put a dam across here as well to create a bit of suction, likewise across the front. We just tuck the front edge into a convenient fold in the palette here, just to try and hide it from the tongue, and that would give us a basic design. Can we do anything different? Can we make any improvements? Well, of course we can do different things. First of all, with regards indirect retention, this is a classic case for indirect retention. So thinking about what happens when we pull up on the occlusal surface of these artificial teeth, the clasp tips will get stuck in the undercut, and we're going to rotate about my pencil just here. So from a mechanical point of view, the ideal place for our indirect retention would be an incisal rest here on the hard tooth surface. Not very aesthetic, not very nice for the tongue, can affect the speech, all that kind of stuff. So we could come back just onto the cingulum of these central incisors. That would be doable. Just need to bear in mind where the lower incisors are occluding and check if they're going to be these cingulum rests would be interfering with ICP and so on. Or another alternative would be just compromise and put cingulum rests on the two canines, and that would give us a degree of indirect retention as well. Always difficult to quantify these things, how much indirect retention you're going to be getting. There's no brilliant way of quantifying indirect retention. Of course, we know that mechanically this one's an incisal rest on the central is going to be more effective, but how much more effective, difficult to know. So a good compromise would be this cingulum rests on the canines, designed around any guidance and ICP contacts, something that needs to be checked. I've kept the connector free from this premolar. We could incorporate this premolar as well, put a rest on there for indirect retention, or even another clasp to improve retention. It's a question of how much it's going to improve that retention. So there we've got a reasonable starting point for you to go and talk to a clinical tutor about, and to check whether these abutment teeth and supporting teeth are going to be suitable for the components that we're putting on there. Other things we could do, we could create an open design. There we're reducing support and retention, compromising support and retention. We could do a horseshoe design. Overall, full palette would be better from a mechanical point of view. Okay, so that's number 3. If we were going to do a mucosa borne design for number 3, it would be pretty similar. We'd have something like this. We'd go through the same design process, saddles, support, retention, reciprocation, and so on and so forth. The differences really are that the support would be gained from the footprint of the denture. The connector would come up to and above the survey line on each of these abutment teeth to get a degree of support and get a good fit between the denture and those abutment teeth, and to provide some bracing. And then we could still have clasps onto these abutment teeth, these premolars as well, just raw clasps. Or you could have cast cobalt chrome bonds incorporated if you wished, and these can be stainless steel. And then we've still got the same consideration with regards path of displacement and path of insertion, but the remainder really is just a simple acrylic denture, but still go through that same sequence of design to get there. So model number 4 then, a little bit tricky this one really, because it's a unilateral free end saddle. So here again we've got a mucosa borne portion of the denture. Again, we want to limit the occlusal table where possible. And then we've got nothing really on this side. This is a missing tooth, but it's not a saddle area as such. It's this missing 7, the 8's drifted forward. We've got the 6 standing. It's given us a convenient space to bring some metalwork round onto this tooth when we get to that stage. So when we're looking at support then, same rule, occlusal rest on the opposite side of the abutment tooth because it's a free end saddle. We're going to need some support around this side of the arch, so that's where I'd go for the 6 because it's easy to access here, and I'd put my distal, I'll put a distal occlusal rest on here as a minimum. And once we've done our support, we can think about retention. So back on the surveyor, surveying this tooth and this tooth particularly, considering whether we want to create a path of insertion. In this case, I'd keep it simple again and just make the path of insertion equal the path of displacement. Because again, there's a little undercut and it'd complicate things trying to engage with this tooth as well at the same time. So I'd keep it simple. And then with regards clasping, there's some nice undercut just here on the mesial aspect of this molar tooth, and some on the buccal, the mesial buccal aspect of this tooth, and a big nice high survey line on the buccal aspect of this premolar. So again, gingerly approaching clasp here, and this I'd make an occlusally approaching clasp, so above the survey line for the bulk of the clasp arm, and then the clasp tip just dips down below the survey line and into the undercut. And then again, a reciprocating plate opposing each clasp tip, and again you could put reciprocating arms on if you wished. Just be mindful you need to be back on the surveyor and checking that lingual aspect of the teeth, and you could go for RPI on this tooth if you wished. And then we need to connect all this up. So let's start with a lingual bar like so to connect these components up together, so it's going to be nice and rigid. And then finally we can think about indirect retention, and for indirect retention we're going to be looking at what happens when we pull up on this on the occlusal surface of these artificial teeth, and we're going to start rotating about an axis between these two clasp tips. So we want some indirect retention by putting a cingulum rest on the teeth in this area down here, and again a good compromise would be onto the cingulum of that canine just there like so, and that will provide some indirect retention. If you really wanted to go for it, you could bring the metalwork up onto the cingulum of all of these lower incisors and produce a lingual plate, maybe a little bit over the top in this case. Other things that you might want to consider then, this funny little gap, whether you want to bridge the gap with a bit of metalwork, so put a mesial rest on this distal tooth and make a little hat across, open underneath just to stop food packing down. That'd be a reasonable thing to do. If you're doing that, you might want to incorporate another clasp, but that's a reasonable design for this pattern of tooth loss. For a mucosa borne design then, really challenging because we've got very little surface area on which to sit our mucosa borne denture. So we've got our saddle area here just the same. If we wanted to bring our denture around to this side of the arch to create bracing and retention and support, we've got no supporting area around this side of the arch, so we'd have to try and bring the acrylic work up to and above the survey line and all these teeth, and still you'd be very limited with the amount of support that you get. So really this isn't a workable option. A mucosa borne denture in this situation just isn't really feasible. Okay, so that's models number 3 and 4. Let me know if you've got any queries. I'll do the next ones.